The narcissist's karma is already here, their downfall is set, and I want to begin with something honest about this title before we write a single word of the episode, because honesty is what actually serves you and your channel more than a title that promises something the psychology cannot fully deliver. The concept of karma as it applies to narcissists is one of the most searched, most emotionally resonant topics in the entire narcissism content space. And the reason it resonates so powerfully is completely understandable. People who have been genuinely harmed by narcissistic behavior want proportionate consequence, want the assurance that what was done does not simply continue without cost, want the specific relief of knowing that the person who caused significant damage is not moving through the world entirely unaffected by the damage they caused. That desire is legitimate, and this episode is going to honor it honestly rather than simply confirming it dramatically. Because the most useful content for your audience is not the content that tells them what they most want to hear. It is the content that tells them what is actually true in a way that is genuinely useful for their healing. And what is actually true about narcissistic consequences, the real costs, the real limitations, the real ways that the narcissist's psychology produces its own form of consequence that is not dramatic, but is genuine, is more interesting and more specifically useful than the simple karma narrative. Let's start with what consequence actually looks like in the narcissist's life, because the dramatic version, the public downfall, the visible collapse, the obvious suffering that confirms justice has been served, is not the most common form the consequence takes. The most common form is considerably more interior and considerably more specific, and it is genuinely present, not as punishment delivered from outside, as the natural, structural, unavoidable consequence of the narcissistic psychology's own functioning operating across a sufficient duration. The first genuine consequence is the one we have discussed in previous conversations, but that deserves examination in this specific context. It is the permanent structural insufficiency of the supply landscape. The narcissist's construction requires continuous, specifically regulatory supply to keep the actual self's anxiety below the threshold of acute conscious experience. And the supply landscape, however efficiently the supply-seeking mechanism navigates it, has a specific limitation that becomes more pronounced across time. The limitation is this: the most specifically regulatory supply, the supply that addresses the actual self's deepest needs rather than simply managing the construction's surface requirements, is the rarest supply available. It is the supply that comes from genuine connection with someone who sees past the construction to what is actually there. The supply that comes from being genuinely known. And the narcissist's construction, by its very nature, prevents the genuine connection that would produce this supply, while simultaneously producing the actual self's need for it. The construction was built to protect the actual self from the exposure that genuine knowing requires. But the actual self's need for genuine knowing does not disappear because the construction is preventing it from being met. It persists. It accumulates. It becomes, across the full duration of the narcissist's relational history, an increasingly acute and increasingly unaddressable hunger that the supply the construction can generate never quite satisfies. This is the narcissist's most foundational karma, not something imposed from outside, but something generated from inside by the very psychology that was organized around protecting against it. The construction that was built to prevent the wound from being exposed prevents the wound from ever being healed. And the wound, unhealed across the full duration of the narcissist's adult life, produces a specific quality of interior experience that accumulates rather than resolves. The 3 a.m. quality we have discussed. The background flatness underneath the new relationship surfaces. The specific insufficiency of every supply arrangement that is not organized around genuine knowing, which is every supply arrangement available to a construction that prevents genuine knowing from occurring. The second genuine consequence is the one that is most visible to people who observe the narcissist across a sufficient time period. It is the progressive narrowing of the relational landscape. Narcissistic dynamics, whatever they produce for the narcissist in the short term, produce a specific long-term cost in the relational world the narcissist inhabits. The people who were genuinely significant, who brought genuine depth and genuine caring and genuine perception to the relationship, these people leave. Not always dramatically. Sometimes through the slow, accumulated withdrawal of their genuine investment that the dynamic's consistent extraction eventually makes unavoidable. Sometimes through the specific, clear-eyed decision of someone who has developed sufficient understanding of what the dynamic is to make the leaving feel necessary rather than simply painful. However it happens, the genuinely significant people leave. And what remains in the narcissist's relational landscape after enough of the genuinely significant people have left is a specific, identifiable reduction in the relational quality available. The relationships that persist tend to be the ones that are organized around the surface functioning of the construction rather than around anything that reaches what is underneath it. Which means the supply they provide is the supply the construction can generate. Which means the actual self's accumulating hunger goes increasingly unaddressed. Which means the interior experience of the narcissist who has been operating for decades continues its quiet, unspectacular, structurally generated deterioration towards something that looks, from the outside, like a person who has everything the construction was designed to produce, and who is experiencing it with a specific, unlocatable, never quite adequate quality that the visible life does not explain. The third genuine consequence is the one that the aging process makes most specifically acute, and that we touched on in a previous episode. It is the convergence of supply scarcity and mortality awareness at the stage of life when the construction's resources are most depleted and the actual self's unaddressed contents are most proximate to the surface. The narcissist who reaches this stage has been running the construction for decades, has been generating supply to manage the anxiety, has been preventing genuine connection in the very act of pursuing it, has been accumulating the actual self's unprocessed knowledge of what was done and who was harmed and what was genuinely valuable that the construction prevented from being honored. And now the supply is scarcer and the mortality is present, and the management mechanisms are less resourced. And what the convergence produces is the most acute and the most genuinely distressing interior experience the narcissist's psychology generates across the full arc of their life. Not the dramatic collapse. The quiet, persistent, increasingly unmanageable quality of someone whose interior landscape contains more than the reduced management capacity can keep below the surface. That is the karma. Not imposed, generated by the psychology itself, across the full duration of its own operation, and what it produces specifically, and why it constitutes the downfall the title is pointing at, and what it means for the person who was harmed to understand this rather than waiting for the dramatic version. That is exactly where we are going next. What the convergence produces specifically, the meeting of supply scarcity and mortality awareness in a construction whose resources are depleted, is worth describing with the honesty this topic genuinely deserves, rather than with the dramatic framing that the karma narrative tends to invite. The honest account is this: the narcissist's interior experience in this stage is genuinely difficult. The actual self's contents, increasingly proximate to the surface as the management mechanisms lose their efficiency, produce a quality of private distress that is real and specific and not adequately captured by either the satisfying narrative of deserved punishment or the cynical dismissal of the narcissist as someone who feels nothing. Something is felt. It is not organized enough or conscious enough or morally sophisticated enough to constitute the full reckoning that the people who were harmed deserve to witness. But it is present. And its presence, however incomplete and however defended against, is the most honest thing the narcissist's psychology produces in relation to the full arc of what the construction was built on and what it cost everyone it touched. This is the karma the title is pointing at, not the dramatic public downfall that the word karma tends to conjure. The quiet, structural, generated from within consequence of a psychology that spent its full operational duration preventing the one thing that would have addressed the wound at the center of everything it built. The construction prevented genuine connection. Genuine connection was the only thing that could have addressed the actual self's wound. The wound, therefore, remains, unaddressed, across the full duration of the life. And what that unaddressed wound produces in the quietest and most private moments of the narcissist's existence is not justice in the satisfying sense. It is the specific, unspectacular, structurally inevitable consequence of a self that was never genuinely met, because the protection against being genuinely met was too thoroughly built to allow the meeting that was most needed. Now, here is where this episode has to do what honest content about this topic almost never does. It has to address directly what this understanding means for the person who was harmed and who is reading or listening to this in whatever stage of their own recovery they currently occupy. Because the karma narrative, however understandable its appeal, carries a specific risk for the person who organizes their healing around it. The risk is this: waiting for the narcissist's karma to arrive, monitoring the narcissist's life for evidence that the consequence is manifesting, organizing some portion of your attention and your emotional energy around the question of whether the narcissist is suffering proportionately to what they did. All of this keeps you oriented toward the narcissist in a way that the healing you deserve is organized around redirecting away from. The narcissist's karma is genuinely present. It is not the dramatic downfall the title promises in its most literal reading. It is the structural, interior, accumulated consequence of a psychology that was organized around preventing what it most needed. And that consequence is real and specific and does not require your monitoring to be occurring. It is occurring regardless of whether you are watching for it, regardless of whether you have any information about the narcissist's current life, regardless of whether the narcissist's public presentation suggests that everything is fine and the consequence is not manifesting. The public presentation is the construction doing what it has always done, maintaining the surface while the interior carries what the surface is specifically organized to prevent from being seen. The interior is where the karma lives, quietly, permanently, without the dramatic expression that would make it visible from outside. What this means for you specifically is the most important thing this episode can offer. Your healing does not require the karma to be visible, does not require the narcissist to be obviously suffering, does not require the consequence to manifest in a form that confirms from the outside that what was done is being proportionately addressed. Your healing requires something entirely different from any of that. It requires the specific, sustained, self-directed investment in the life that the dynamic was occupying, in the clarity that the dynamic was systematically preventing, in the self-trust that the reality contestation was eroding, in the genuine preferences and the genuine voice and the genuine orientation toward your own experience that the relationship required you to redirect toward the narcissist's management for the duration of its functioning. The narcissist's downfall, in the most honest and most complete sense available, is not a future event to be anticipated. It is a present structural reality, the ongoing, daily, privately experienced consequence of a psychology that built an extraordinarily elaborate system for addressing a wound by preventing the only thing that could have addressed it. That is the downfall. Already set, already operating, already producing in the narcissist's interior the specific, quiet, unspectacular consequence that the construction's own functioning makes structurally inevitable. And your rising, The specific, daily, genuinely invested building of the life that the dynamic was preventing is also already happening, not as the mirror image of the narcissist's downfall, as something entirely independent of it, something that does not require the downfall to be visible or dramatic or proportionate in order to be real and significant and genuinely worth the investment it requires. Your rising is the only part of this story that belongs to you. The narcissist's karma belongs to the narcissist's psychology and produces its consequences in the narcissist's interior on its own timeline without requiring your attention to proceed. What requires your attention is your life, the specific, particular, irreplaceable life that was always yours to build and that the dynamic was occupying while you were inside it. That life is not waiting for the karma to manifest. It is not organized around the downfall being confirmed. It is available right now, in whatever moment you are reading this, as the most complete and most specifically personal answer to everything the dynamic cost you. Not because it compensates for the cost, because it is what the cost was preventing and what the ending of the dynamic makes possible. Your life, fully inhabited, genuinely invested in, organized entirely around your own knowing and your own worth and your own genuine preferences and your own clear perception of what is real. That life is the only downfall of the narcissist's influence over you that actually matters. And it is already set, because you are already here, already reading this, already oriented towards something the dynamic was organized to prevent. That orientation is the beginning. It has already begun, and what it builds from here belongs entirely to you.